Have you ever received a phone call so shocking, so utterly devastating that it made your blood run cold? Now imagine that call was a complete lie, designed to steal everything from you. That's exactly what happened to 72-year-old Margaret Hayes when her brother Richard called with news of their mother's death. There was just one problem. Their mother, Dorothy, was standing right next to Margaret in her kitchen, very much alive, sipping tea and watching the whole thing unfold. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of family betrayal, greed, and the sweetest revenge you'll ever hear, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. These real-life tales of karma and justice are what we live for, and trust me, you're going to want to stick around for every twist and turn in this one. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop a comment below and tell me your city or country. It's amazing to see our community growing all around the world, and I read every single comment. Now, let's get into Margaret's story, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. It was a cold Tuesday morning in March when Margaret's phone rang. She'd been living in the small coastal town of Brookhaven for nearly 40 years, in the same modest two-bedroom house she'd bought with her late husband. Her mother, Dorothy, had moved in with her 6 months earlier, after a minor health scare convinced them both that living together made sense. At 89 years old, Dorothy was still remarkably sharp, still fiercely independent, and still capable of cooking a mean pot roast that could feed half the neighborhood. Margaret had just finished setting out breakfast when her phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID showed Richard's name, and her stomach immediately tightened. Her younger brother rarely called anymore, maybe once every few months. And when he did, it was usually to ask for money or complain about something. Their relationship had been strained for years, ever since Richard had made some poor business decisions and started seeing everyone in the family as potential ATMs rather than actual human beings. She answered on the third ring. "Hello, Richard." His voice came through cold and flat, completely devoid of emotion. "Margaret, I have some news. Mom died last night." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Margaret felt her hand tighten around the phone, her knees suddenly weak. Dorothy, who had been arranging flowers at the kitchen table just 10 feet away, looked up at the sound of her daughter's sharp intake of breath. "What?" Margaret managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "What did you just say?" "Mom died last night," Richard repeated, his tone still eerily calm, almost businesslike. "Peacefully in her sleep. The funeral is Friday at 2 o'clock at Riverside Memorial. I've already made all the arrangements." He cut her off. "There's something else you need to know. Mom updated her will about 3 months ago. She left everything to me. The house she owned in Millbrook, all her savings, her investments, everything. You get nothing, Margaret. I thought you should know before the funeral." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood frozen in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, staring at her very much alive mother, who was now standing up from her chair with a confused expression on her face. "Richard, what are you talking about?" Margaret finally managed to say, her voice gaining strength. "Mom is literally standing right here. She's alive. She's looking at me right now." She expected shock, embarrassment, maybe even an awkward laugh and some ridiculous explanation. Instead, Richard's voice took on an edge of irritation. "Don't play games with me, Margaret. I know this is hard to accept, but denial isn't going to change anything. Mom's gone, and she made her wishes clear. The will is legal and binding. I'm just giving you the courtesy of letting you know." That's when it clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding or some terrible mistake. This was deliberate. This was calculated. Richard was trying to convince her that their mother was dead when she was standing right there in the kitchen. But why? What could he possibly hope to gain? Dorothy had moved closer now, her eyes wide with concern and growing anger as she watched her daughter's face cycle through confusion, shock, and finally, realization. "Richard," Margaret said slowly, her voice steady now, controlled. "I'm going to say this one more time. Mom is alive. She is standing right next to you. Whatever you're trying to do, it's not going to work." His response chilled her to the bone. "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but I won't be manipulated. Mom is dead. Accept it. The funeral is Friday. You're welcome to attend, but don't expect anything from the estate. Goodbye, Margaret." The line went dead. Margaret stood there, holding the phone, her hands shaking now, not from grief, but from pure rage. Dorothy reached out and took the phone from her daughter's hand, setting it gently on the counter. "What just happened?" Dorothy asked, her voice quiet but firm. Margaret looked at her mother. This woman who had raised 2 children, who had worked double shifts as a nurse to put them through school, who had sacrificed so much to give them good lives. And one of those children had just tried to declare her dead to steal her money. "Richard just told me you died last night," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "He said your funeral is Friday and that you left everything to him in your will." Dorothy's face went through its own transformation. First shock, then confusion, and finally something Margaret hadn't seen in years. Cold, calculated fury. "He did what?" Dorothy's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderstorm. Margaret grabbed her mother's hands. "Mom, did you change your will 3 months ago?" Dorothy shook her head firmly. "I haven't touched my will in 15 years. It's still split evenly between you and Richard, just like it's always been. I would never cut you out. You know that." The pieces were falling into place now, and the picture they created was uglier than Margaret could have imagined. Richard was attempting to fake their mother's death, claim the entire inheritance, and presumably planned to make it look legitimate somehow. But how? And more importantly, why did he think he could get away with it? Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Dorothy sat across from her, her hands folded on the table, that steely determination in her eyes that Margaret recognized from childhood. It was the same look her mother had worn when dealing with difficult landlords, pushy salesmen, or anyone who thought they could take advantage of her family. "We need to think this through carefully," Dorothy said, her nurse's training kicking in. Even in crisis, her mother had always been the calm one, the problem solver. Richard wouldn't do something this bold unless he had a plan. He must think he has some way to make this work. Margaret nodded, pulling her laptop toward her. "Let me check something." Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she logged into her email, then into the family lawyer's client portal. Their mother's will was held by Thomas Chen, an attorney who had handled the family's legal matters for over 2 decades. Margaret had access to the documents as the designated health proxy and co-executor. What she found made her blood run cold. "Mom," she said quietly, turning the laptop around. "Look at this." There, dated just 8 weeks earlier, was a new will. It bore Dorothy's name, her supposed signature, and named Richard Hayes as the sole beneficiary of Dorothy's entire estate. The document appeared to have been notarized and filed properly. It looked completely legitimate. Dorothy leaned forward, squinting at the screen. She pulled out her reading glasses and examined the signature carefully. "That's not my signature," she said flatly. "It's close, very close, but look at the way the D curves. I always make that loop smaller. And the Y at the end of Dorothy. That tail is too long. Margaret zoomed in on the signature. Her mother was right. It was an excellent forgery, the kind that might fool someone who didn't know Dorothy's handwriting intimately, but it wasn't perfect. The question was, would it fool a court? There's more, Margaret said, scrolling down. Look at the notary stamp, Elizabeth Pemberton. That name sounds familiar. Dorothy's eyes widened. Elizabeth Pemberton. She used to work at the county clerk's office. She retired about 5 years ago, after some kind of scandal. I remember reading about it in the local paper. Something about improperly notarized documents. The picture was getting clearer and uglier. Richard had somehow gotten hold of a disgraced notary, forged their mother's signature, and created a fraudulent will. But that still didn't explain the death announcement. How did he plan to convince the world that Dorothy was actually dead? Margaret grabbed her phone and called Thomas Chen's office. The receptionist put her through immediately. "Margaret, I was just about to call you," Thomas said, his voice tight with concern. "I received some very disturbing documentation this morning. A death certificate for your mother, along with instructions from Richard to begin probate proceedings on her estate." "A death certificate?" Margaret's voice rose. "Thomas, my mother is sitting right here in my kitchen. She's alive." There was a pause on the other end. "I was hoping you'd say that. The whole thing felt wrong to me. The death certificate came from Riverside Hospital, but when I called to verify, they had no record of Dorothy Hayes being admitted or passing away. I was about to contact the authorities." "Wait," Margaret said, her mind working. "If the hospital has no record, then where did the death certificate come from?" "That's what concerns me," Thomas replied. "It appears to be a forgery, but again, it's a very good one. Someone went to considerable trouble to make this look legitimate. Margaret, I think your brother is attempting to commit several very serious crimes. Forgery, fraud, identity theft, and possibly conspiracy if he had help." Dorothy had been listening to the conversation on speakerphone. She leaned forward and spoke clearly. "Thomas, this is Dorothy. I'm very much alive, as you can hear. What do we do now?" Thomas's relief was audible. "First, we document everything. Margaret, I need you to take a video of Dorothy with today's newspaper, showing the date clearly. We need time-stamped proof that she's alive. Then we need to contact the police immediately. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is criminal fraud. But we need to understand his whole plan first," Margaret said slowly. An idea was forming in her mind. "If we go to the police now, Richard will just claim it was all a misunderstanding, hire some expensive lawyer, and drag this out for years. We need to catch him in the act. Make sure he can't wriggle out of this." "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked cautiously. Margaret looked at her mother, who was watching her with that same calculating expression. "I'm suggesting we let him think his plan is working. Mom plays dead for a few days. We see exactly what he does, who he's working with, and gather evidence that will make this case airtight." Dorothy smiled slowly. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just decided that her son needed to learn a very hard lesson. "I like it," she said simply. Thomas sighed. "I cannot officially advise you to do this. As your attorney, I should tell you to contact law enforcement immediately." "Noted," Margaret said. "And off the record?" "Off the record? I think your brother has been underestimating the women in his family for far too long. But be careful. If he's desperate enough to forge a death certificate, there's no telling what else he might do." After hanging up with Thomas, Margaret and Dorothy spent the next hour planning. They decided that Dorothy would stay at Margaret's house, keeping a low profile and avoiding places where she might be recognized. Margaret would play the role of the grieving daughter, attending the funeral Richard had arranged, watching and documenting everything. "I want to know everyone involved," Dorothy said firmly. "If Richard had help doing this, they all need to face consequences. I won't have people thinking they can prey on elderly citizens like this." Margaret pulled out a notepad and started making a list. "Okay, we know about the notary, Elizabeth Pemberton. We need to find out how Richard connected with her and if she knew what she was doing was illegal. Then there's whoever helped him create the fake death certificate. That had to come from someone with access to official forms. And the funeral home," Dorothy added. "Did Richard actually book Riverside Memorial for Friday? If he did, what did he tell them? They'd need to see a death certificate before arranging a funeral." Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Riverside Memorial, putting on her best grieving daughter voice. "Hi. Yes, I'm calling about the funeral services for Dorothy Hayes on Friday. I'm her daughter Margaret, and I just wanted to confirm the arrangements." The funeral director, a man named Peter Sanderson, came on the line. His voice was professionally sympathetic. "Yes, Ms. Hayes, your brother Richard made all the arrangements yesterday. He seemed quite distraught, wanted everything handled quickly. We have the viewing scheduled for Thursday evening and the service Friday at 2 o'clock. "Did he provide you with the death certificate?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, he did. Everything appeared to be in order." "I'm so sorry for your loss, Miss Hayes. Your mother's obituary will run in tomorrow's paper as well. Richard wrote a lovely tribute to her." Margaret thanked him and hung up, then immediately looked up the local newspaper's website. Sure enough, there it was, already posted online. Dorothy Marie Hayes, 89, passed away peacefully on March 14th. Beloved mother of Richard Hayes and Margaret Hayes. Services to be held Friday at Riverside Memorial. Dorothy read the obituary over Margaret's shoulder, her jaw tightening. "He didn't even mention that I was a nurse for 40 years, or that I volunteered at the Children's Hospital. Just my name, age, and that I was his mother. He's trying to make this look as real as possible," Margaret said. "The obituary, the funeral home, the death certificate. If anyone questions it, there's a paper trail. And once the funeral happens, once I'm there acting like the grieving daughter, it becomes even harder to prove this was all fake." "Except I'll still be alive," Dorothy pointed out. "Exactly," Margaret said, a plan crystallizing in her mind. "And I think I know exactly when we should reveal that fact." Over the next 2 days, Margaret watched as Richard's elaborate scheme unfolded with disturbing precision. He had thought of everything, or at least he believed he had. The obituary appeared in both the local newspaper and online memorial sites. Flowers began arriving at Riverside Memorial. Former colleagues of Dorothy's from the hospital called Margaret's house, leaving tearful voice messages expressing their condolences. Each call was like a knife twist, not because of grief, but because of the sheer audacity of what Richard was attempting. Margaret played her role perfectly. She returned calls with a shaky voice, thanked people for their kind words, and confirmed that yes, the funeral would be Friday at 2 o'clock. All the while, Dorothy stayed hidden in the guest bedroom, monitoring everything from Margaret's laptop. They had set up a system where Dorothy could watch the security cameras Margaret had hastily installed around the house, just in case Richard decided to pay a surprise visit. "This is surreal," Dorothy said on Thursday morning, reading through the condolence messages that had been posted on her memorial page. "People I haven't spoken to in years are sharing memories and stories. It's like attending your own wake." Margaret brought her mother a cup of coffee. "How are you holding up, Mom? This has to be incredibly painful, knowing Richard is capable of this." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the gray March sky. You know what the worst part is? It's not even the money. If Richard had come to me and said he was in trouble, that he needed help, I would have given him whatever I could. But he didn't want to ask. He wanted to take, and he was willing to erase me, to treat me like I was already dead, just to get what he thought he deserved. We're going to make this right, Margaret promised. That afternoon, Margaret received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, a professional woman's voice greeted her. Ms. Hayes, this is Patricia Winters from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding the estate accounts for Dorothy Hayes. Your brother Richard was here this morning attempting to access several accounts, but we need your signature as well since you're listed as a co-beneficiary on the existing will. Could you come in tomorrow morning? Margaret's heart raced. Tomorrow is the funeral. Could we schedule it for next week? Of course, Patricia said. I'm so sorry for your loss. We'll hold everything until you're ready. My condolences to you and your family. After hanging up, Margaret relayed the conversation to Dorothy. He's already trying to get the money. The funeral isn't even until tomorrow, and he's at the bank. That's desperation, Dorothy observed. Or arrogance, maybe both. The question is, why? What does Richard need money for so urgently that he'd do all this? Margaret had been wondering the same thing. She opened her laptop and started searching. It didn't take long to find answers. A few strategic searches revealed that Richard's business, a commercial real estate company, was facing multiple lawsuits. Contractors claiming unpaid bills, investors alleging fraud, even a few former employees suing for back wages. The numbers were staggering. Richard wasn't just in debt. He was drowning in it. He owes over $2 million, Margaret said, showing her mother the court documents she'd found. If he can't pay, he'll lose everything. He might even face criminal charges for some of these business dealings. Dorothy absorbed this information silently. So, he's not just greedy. He's desperate. That makes him even more dangerous, Margaret. Desperate people do desperate things. All the more reason to end this tomorrow, Margaret said firmly. I've been thinking about the timing. The funeral is at 2 o'clock. What if you make your appearance right at the peak of the service, when Richard is standing up there, probably giving some fake eulogy, playing the grieving son? A slow smile spread across Dorothy's face. Maximum impact. Maximum witnesses. He won't be able to explain his way out of it with a church full of people watching. They spent the evening preparing. Margaret had contacted Thomas Chen, who had quietly reached out to a detective he knew in the police department. Detective Rachel Kowalski had been briefed on the situation and would be attending the funeral in plain clothes, ready to make arrests once Dorothy revealed herself. They'd also arranged for a videographer, officially there to record the service, but actually documenting everything for evidence. Thursday evening brought the viewing at Riverside Memorial. This was the part Margaret had been dreading most. Walking into a funeral home, looking at an empty casket, pretending to mourn while her mother was alive and well back at home, felt like a special kind of torture. The funeral home had set up a closed casket, which made sense since there was no actual body. Richard had apparently told them that Dorothy had requested a closed casket service. Fresh flowers surrounded it, and soft music played in the background. About 30 people had shown up, mostly Dorothy's former colleagues and a few distant family members. Richard was there, dressed in an expensive black suit, playing the role of devoted son with Oscar-worthy commitment. He stood near the casket, shaking hands, accepting condolences, his face a perfect mask of grief. Margaret watched him from across the room, feeling her anger build with each fake tear, each sorrowful nod. When she finally approached him, Richard pulled her into a stiff hug. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "I know things have been difficult between us, but Mom would have wanted us together today." The sheer hypocrisy of it took Margaret's breath away. She pulled back and looked him in the eye. "She would have wanted a lot of things, Richard. I'm sure tomorrow will be very revealing about what she actually wanted." Something flickered in his eyes. Suspicion? Concern? But his mask stayed in place. "Yes, well, we'll honor her memory the best we can." Margaret moved through the room, accepting condolences from people who had known and loved her mother. Each conversation was genuine from their side, full of real grief for a woman they believed was gone. Several people shared stories about Dorothy's kindness, her dedication as a nurse, the lives she'd touched. Margaret made mental notes of everything, knowing that tomorrow these same people would witness something extraordinary. She noticed Richard speaking quietly in the corner with a thin woman in her 60s. The woman looked nervous, kept glancing around as if afraid of being watched. When Margaret casually drifted closer, pretending to examine the flower arrangements, she caught part of their conversation. "Everything is ready for tomorrow," the woman was saying. "But I'm telling you, Richard, I don't like this. If anyone looks too closely—" "No one is going to look closely," Richard interrupted, his voice low and sharp. "Everything is legitimate. The paperwork is perfect. After tomorrow, once the service is done, it becomes even more real. Who's going to question a funeral that actually happened?" Paragraph. The woman nodded but still looked uncertain. "And the payment we discussed?" Paragraph. "You'll get it next week as soon as the estate clears," Richard assured her. "Elizabeth, you've done this kind of work before. This is no different." Elizabeth. Margaret's pulse quickened. This had to be Elizabeth Pemberton, the disgraced notary who had helped forge Dorothy's will. She was right here, attending the fake viewing for a woman she'd helped declare dead on paper. The audacity was breathtaking. Paragraph. Margaret pulled out her phone and discreetly took a photo, making it look like she was checking messages. She got a clear shot of Elizabeth and Richard together. More evidence for tomorrow. As the viewing wound down, Richard made a point of approaching Margaret again. "I know we didn't part on good terms during that phone call," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I was in shock, not thinking clearly. Of course you're still family. Of course you matter." "How generous of you," Margaret said, her tone neutral. She wasn't ready to tip her hand yet, but she couldn't help adding, "Mom always said that family was everything, that blood meant loyalty, meant honesty, meant protecting each other no matter what." I wonder what she'd think about all this. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure she'd be proud that we're here together, honoring her." "Oh, I think she'll have very strong opinions about what's happening here," Margaret said. "I guess we'll find out tomorrow." She left him standing there, confusion and suspicion warring on his face. Let him wonder. Let him spend tonight worried about what she meant. Tomorrow, he'd understand completely. Back at home, Margaret found Dorothy waiting up despite the late hour. "How was it?" her mother asked. "Surreal, infuriating, but also informative," Margaret said, showing her the photo of Richard and Elizabeth. "I got evidence of them together, and I overheard them discussing payment. Richard promised her money once the estate clears. She's definitely part of this conspiracy." Dorothy studied the photo. "I want to see her face tomorrow when I walk in. I want to see all their faces." Friday morning dawned cold and gray, perfectly matching the somber occasion that everyone believed they were attending. Margaret woke early, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. Today was the day. Today, Richard's entire elaborate scheme would come crashing down around him, and justice would finally be served. Dorothy was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress. She looked remarkably calm for someone about to crash her own funeral. "Ready for this?" Margaret asked, pouring herself coffee with shaking hands. "I've been ready since Tuesday," Dorothy replied. "The question is, are you ready? Once we do this, there's no going back. Richard is your brother, and after today, that relationship is essentially over." Margaret sat down across from her mother and took her hand. "Mom, Richard ended that relationship the moment he decided you were worth more to him dead than alive. I'm not losing a brother today. I'm exposing a criminal who happens to share my DNA." They went over the plan one final time. Margaret would arrive at the funeral early, at 1:30, and position herself near the front. Detective Kowalski would already be there, seated in the back with a clear view of everything. Thomas Chen would be present as well, along with the videographer. Dorothy would wait in Margaret's car, in the parking lot, until exactly 2:15, 15 minutes into the service, right when Richard would typically be giving his eulogy. At 1:20, Margaret's phone rang. It was Thomas. "Margaret, we have a problem. I just got a call from Richard's attorney, a man named Douglas Brennan. Apparently, Richard is planning to file all the estate paperwork on Monday morning. He's not even waiting a decent interval. He wants to liquidate everything immediately. Can he do that?" Margaret asked, putting the phone on speaker so Dorothy could hear. "Technically, with the fraudulent will and death certificate, he might be able to initiate the process," Thomas said, "but it would require multiple signatures and verifications. The fact that he's moving this fast suggests he's even more desperate than we thought. Margaret, I'm concerned about what he might do if he feels cornered today. That's why Detective Kowalski will be there," Margaret assured him. "We're not doing anything that puts anyone at risk. We're just revealing the truth." After hanging up, Dorothy looked at her daughter seriously. "Thomas is right to be concerned. Richard has invested everything in this scheme. When it falls apart, he's going to be facing criminal charges and financial ruin. People in that situation can become unpredictable. Then we stick to the plan but stay vigilant," Margaret said firmly. "We're ending this today." At 1:15, Margaret climbed into her car for the short drive to Riverside Memorial. Dorothy lay down in the back seat, covered with a blanket. "This is ridiculous," Dorothy muttered. "I feel like I'm in some kind of spy movie." "A spy movie where you get to haunt your own funeral," Margaret said, trying to lighten the mood despite her racing heart. "How many people can say that?" The parking lot at Riverside Memorial was already filling up when they arrived. Margaret was surprised to see so many cars. Apparently, Dorothy had touched more lives than even she had realized. Margaret helped her mother into a more comfortable position in the back seat, made sure the blanket covered her completely, and locked the doors. "I'll text you when it's time," Margaret said through the barely cracked window. "Are you sure you're okay waiting here?" "I've waited 89 years to see something like this," Dorothy replied, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "I can wait another 45 minutes. Inside, Riverside Memorial had been transformed into a picture of mourning. More flowers had arrived, creating a garden of color around the closed casket. Soft organ music played. People were already seated, talking in hushed tones, some crying genuine tears for a woman they had known and loved. Margaret felt a pang of guilt for the deception, but reminded herself that these people deserved to know the truth about Richard, too. She spotted Detective Kowalski immediately, despite the detective's attempt to blend in. She was a tall woman in her 40s, with sharp, observant eyes that constantly scanned the room. She gave Margaret the slightest nod of acknowledgement before returning her attention to the gathering crowd. Thomas Chen arrived next, taking a seat near the middle of the room. The videographer was already set up in the back corner, his camera on a tripod, apparently recording the service for family members who couldn't attend. No one questioned his presence. It was becoming increasingly common to live stream or record funeral services. At 1:45, Richard arrived. He had changed into an even more expensive-looking suit, black with subtle pinstripes. He moved through the room like a politician at a campaign event, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, accepting sympathies with practiced grace. Margaret watched him work the room and felt physically ill. He was good at this, too good. Elizabeth Pemberton was there too, seated near the back, trying to remain inconspicuous. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Margaret noticed Detective Kowalski's gaze linger on Elizabeth for a long moment before moving on. At precisely 2:00, the funeral director, Peter Sanderson, moved to the front of the room and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming to celebrate the life of Dorothy Marie Hayes. We'll begin with an opening prayer, followed by some words from her son, Richard Hayes. The prayer was generic, professional, and mercifully brief. Then Richard stood and walked to the podium, arranging his notes with deliberate care. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. This was it. This was when he would deliver a eulogy for a mother he had tried to steal from, whose life he had valued only in dollar signs. My mother, Richard began, his voice thick with manufactured emotion, was an extraordinary woman, strong, independent, devoted to her family. She worked tirelessly as a nurse, touching countless lives, always putting others before herself. Margaret wanted to scream. These words, which should have been beautiful and true, were poison coming from his mouth. He was describing Dorothy accurately, which somehow made it worse. He knew who she was, knew what she'd sacrificed, and he'd still been willing to declare her dead for his own gain. She taught me about integrity, Richard continued, and several people in the audience nodded, completely unaware of the irony. About honesty and family loyalty. Everything I am, I owe to her. Margaret pulled out her phone and texted her mother, "He's at the podium, 2 minutes." The reply came instantly, "On my way." Richard was still talking, spinning stories about their childhood, about Dorothy's wisdom and kindness. Some of the stories were even true, which made Margaret hate him even more in that moment. He was using real memories, genuine moments, to support his elaborate lie. My mother's final gift to this world, Richard said, his voice breaking convincingly, was teaching us that family comes first, always, that we protect each other, support each other. And the back doors of the memorial hall opened. Every head in the room turned at the sound, and there, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, stood Dorothy Marie Hayes. She walked forward slowly, deliberately, her sensible heels clicking on the tile floor. The room had gone absolutely silent. People stared, their mouths open, some rubbing their eyes as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. One woman near the front actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dorothy walked down the center aisle, her gaze fixed on Richard, who had frozen at the podium, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and finally, dawning horror as he realized what was happening. "Don't stop on my account," Dorothy said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent room. "Please, continue telling everyone about my final gift. I'm very interested to hear how this story ends." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His carefully maintained mask had shattered completely, revealing the panic underneath. "Mom, but how? How am I alive?" Dorothy finished for him. She had reached the front of the room now, standing just a few feet from the casket that was supposedly holding her body. "That's an excellent question, Richard. Why don't you tell everyone here how you thought I was dead? Tell them about the phone call you made to your sister on Tuesday, the one where you informed her that I had died the night before and that you were inheriting everything." The silence in the room had transformed from confused shock to electric tension. People were beginning to understand that something very wrong was happening here. Richard's attorney, Douglas Brennan, stood up from his seat. "I think we need to pause this service, obviously. There's been some kind of misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Detective Kowalski said, rising and pulling out her badge, "is Richard Hayes thinking he could commit fraud and get away with it. Everyone, please remain seated. This is now a crime scene." Richard collapsed back into the front pew, his head in his hands. The mask had finally cracked completely, and what lay beneath wasn't just shame or regret. It was the cold calculation of a man trying to figure out if there was still any way to salvage this, any angle he could work, any lie he could tell that might save him. Detective Kowalski approached Richard with a calm professionalism that somehow made the moment even more damning. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to need you to come with me. We have extensive evidence of multiple felonies, including forgery, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As she read Richard his rights, Margaret watched her brother's face. She waited for remorse, for an apology, for some sign that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Instead, as the detective finished, Richard looked up at Dorothy with something close to hatred in his eyes. "You could have just given it to me," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You have more money than you'll ever need. You're 89 years old. What were you going to do with it all? I needed it. My business, my life, everything was falling apart. You could have helped me, but you never cared. You always loved Margaret more." Dorothy's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw the flash of pain in her mother's eyes. Even now, even after everything, those words could still hurt. "You never asked," Dorothy said quietly. "If you had come to me, explained that you were in trouble, asked for help, we could have figured something out. I would have helped you, Richard. That's what family does. But you didn't want my help. You wanted to erase me. You wanted me dead and gone so you could take what you thought you deserved. That's not need, Richard. That's greed." "Let's go, Mr. Hayes," Detective Kowalski said, guiding him toward the aisle. As they passed Elizabeth Pemberton, who was already in custody with another officer, Richard shot her a venomous look. "This was supposed to be foolproof," he hissed at her. "You said no one would question it." "Don't say another word," Jonathan Hartley finally interjected, his attorney instincts overriding his shock. "Richard, as your lawyer, I'm advising you to remain silent until we can discuss this privately." But Richard wasn't done. As they reached the back of the church, he turned one last time to face the congregation. "You all think you're so much better than me. You come here with your sympathy and your flowers. But where were you when I needed help? When my business was failing? When I was drowning in debt?" As the police led Richard and Elizabeth out of the church, the remaining congregation sat in stunned silence. Reverend Mitchell, who had been frozen by the altar this entire time, finally seemed to regain his composure. "Well," he said, his voice shaky, "this is certainly a first in my 30 years of ministry. I think perhaps we should adjourn and give everyone time to process what just happened." Dorothy stepped forward. "Before everyone leaves, I want to say something." She waited until she had everyone's attention. What happened here today was awful, but it also showed me something important. It showed me who really cares, who showed up to honor someone they thought was gone. Thank you for that. Your presence here, your stories about our time working together, your genuine grief, that meant more to me than you'll ever know. Even if I wasn't actually dead to appreciate it. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the chapel. The tension broke slightly, and people began to stand, many of them moving toward Dorothy to embrace her, to express their relief that she was alive, to ask questions about what had actually happened. Margaret stood back and watched her mother handle the crowd with the same grace and strength she'd shown her entire life. Janet, Dorothy's former colleague, was crying and holding Dorothy's hands. We were all so shocked when we heard. You seemed so healthy at the hospital volunteer event last month. I am healthy, Dorothy assured her, and I plan to stay that way for a good while longer. This whole thing has reminded me that life is precious and not to be taken for granted. Over the next hour, as the chapel slowly emptied, Margaret, Dorothy, and Detective Kowalski moved to a small office at the funeral home to discuss the case. Thomas Chen, the family attorney, joined them via video call. The evidence is overwhelming, Detective Kowalski said, reviewing her notes. We have the forged will, the fake death certificate, the obituary, witness testimony from the funeral home, the bank, and dozens of people who attended today's service. We have Richard on video making false statements during his eulogy. We have Elizabeth Pemberton's history of notary fraud. This case is about as solid as they come. What kind of charges are we looking at? Dorothy asked. For Richard, we're looking at multiple counts of forgery, identity theft, attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and potentially more as we dig deeper into his business dealings. For Elizabeth Pemberton, conspiracy, forgery, and fraud. They're both looking at significant prison time if convicted. Thomas Chen spoke from the laptop screen. Dorothy, I know this is your son, and this is an incredibly difficult position. You have the option to not press charges if you choose. It would make the criminal case harder to prosecute without your cooperation. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Margaret reached over and took her mother's hand. Mom, whatever you decide, I'll support you. Dorothy took a deep breath. When I was a nurse, we had a saying. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their actions. If you keep protecting people from their mistakes, they never learn. They never change. She looked up, her eyes clear and determined. I'm pressing charges, all of them. Richard needs help, but he also needs to be held accountable. Maybe prison will give him time to think about what he's become and who he wants to be when he gets out. Detective Kowalski nodded. I think that's the right choice. And for what it's worth, what he did wasn't just wrong morally. It's the kind of crime that preys on vulnerable, elderly people. If we don't prosecute this fully, he might try something like this again, or others might see it as a blueprint. There's one more thing, Margaret said. Richard mentioned his financial troubles during his outburst. Should we be investigating his business practices more thoroughly? Already on it, the detective confirmed. We've contacted the fraud division, and they're looking into his real estate company. Based on the lawsuits and complaints we found, there may be additional criminal charges related to his business dealings. This case opened up a much larger investigation. As the meeting wrapped up, Margaret drove her mother home in silence. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Dorothy let out a long, exhausted sigh. Are you okay, Mom? Margaret asked. I don't know, Dorothy admitted. I'm relieved it's over. I'm glad we stopped him. But he's still my son, and knowing what he tried to do, knowing he could look at me and see nothing but dollar signs, that breaks my heart. They sat in the car for a moment, neither moving. Then Dorothy spoke again. You know what the saddest part is? If he had just been honest with me, if he had told me he was in trouble and asked for help, I would have given him money. Not everything, but enough to help him get back on his feet. I would have worked with his creditors, helped him restructure his debt, stood by him while he rebuilt. But he couldn't do that. His pride, his greed, whatever it was, it wouldn't let him ask. It would only let him take. That says more about him than it does about you, Margaret said softly. Over the next few weeks, the story made headlines locally and then nationally. Son fakes mother's death to steal inheritance, ran in papers across the country. The video from the funeral, with Dorothy walking down the aisle and Richard's face as he realized his plan had failed, went viral online. People were fascinated by the audacity of the scheme and the poetic justice of its failure. Richard and Elizabeth Pemberton were both denied bail, deemed flight risks. The investigation into Richard's business practices uncovered even more fraud, including a Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors out of nearly $3 million. The charges kept mounting. Jonathan Hartley, Richard's attorney, was cleared of any wrongdoing, since he genuinely hadn't known about the fraud, but his reputation took a hit for being associated with the case. He ended up withdrawing as Richard's counsel, citing conflict of interest. 6 months later, Richard pleaded guilty to avoid an even longer sentence. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Elizabeth Pemberton received 8 years. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing, with many of Richard's business fraud victims present to give impact statements. Dorothy attended the sentencing, sitting quietly in the back row. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she stood. "Your Honor, Richard is my son, and I love him despite what he's done. But love doesn't mean protecting someone from consequences. What he did was calculated and cruel, not just to me, but to everyone he defrauded. I hope that prison gives him time to reflect and perhaps become the person I always believed he could be. But I also hope this case sends a message that elder financial abuse will not be tolerated, that family connections don't excuse criminal behavior, and that greed has a price." Richard wouldn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the floor as he was led away in handcuffs. A year after the funeral that never was, Dorothy threw a party. Not a celebration of anything in particular, just a gathering of friends and family to enjoy life. Margaret helped her set up tables in the backyard, string lights between the trees, and prepare food for 50 guests. As people arrived, the same faces from that awful day at the church. Dorothy greeted each one with genuine warmth. They laughed, told stories, shared memories. It was the gathering Dorothy deserved, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, not what she owned. Late in the evening, as the sun set and the string lights glowed warm against the darkening sky, Janet approached Dorothy and Margaret. "You know," she said, "that whole awful situation taught me something. It taught me not to wait. I've been meaning to tell so many people how much they mean to me, but I keep putting it off. After that day, after thinking we'd lost you, Dorothy, I realized we can't take anything for granted." Dorothy smiled and raised her glass. Dorothy smiled and raised her glass. To not taking things for granted. To honest relationships. To second chances. And to making sure people know you're alive to enjoy them, Margaret added with a grin. They clinked glasses as laughter echoed through the yard. Somewhere in a federal prison, Richard was beginning year 1 of his sentence. But here, in this backyard full of genuine love and friendship, Dorothy was exactly where she was meant to be. Alive, valued, and surrounded by people who saw her as more than just an inheritance waiting to happen. The story became a cautionary tale, shared in elder law circles, used in training seminars about financial abuse, discussed in ethics classes. But for Dorothy and Margaret, it became something else. A reminder that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than comfortable lies, and that real family isn't about blood or money. It's about loyalty, honesty, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Dorothy lived another 7 years after that funeral, active and engaged right up until she passed peacefully in her sleep at age 96. When that day finally came, there was a real funeral, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Margaret gave the eulogy, and every word was true. There was no drama, no last-minute revelations, just a proper goodbye to a woman who had lived her life with integrity and courage. And somewhere, in a notebook Margaret kept, was the full account of that March day when her mother walked into her own funeral, not as a ghost or a miracle, but as a living testament to the fact that some people refuse to be erased, some truths refuse to stay buried, and justice, however delayed, has a way of finding the light.